Welcome back to another crochet tutorial with Cosy Rosie UK. Today I am going to be sharing with you how to crochet the Roving Dreams bed runner. This bed runner will add a really cozy feel to any bed, and this pattern is written for 5 different sizes of bed. I'll give you all the details shortly as to what size they will be. This is a really simple pattern that uses the linen stitch to create a really cozy bed runner. There's also a separate video to create your very own tied fringe. So before we get started, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and of course the notification bell so that you never miss out on another one of my crochet patterns again. So the yarn I used to create the Roving Dreams bed runner is Sirdar Adventure Super Chunky or Super Bulky Weight yarn. So this is a 6 weight yarn, so it's quite a large sized strand of yarn as you can see here. But the reason that this bed runner is called the Roving Dreams bed runner is because this is actually a roving style type of yarn. I've picked this because it looks like those arm crocheted or arm knitted blankets that you find. But it does mean that there is a risk of it looking a bit tired if this yarn is overworked or overused. This yarn creates a beautiful sheen as it's worked up, so it is worth finding either this yarn or a similar yarn. If you live in the UK, Knitcraft by Hobbycraft do offer their very own Cozy On Up Super Chunky yarn, which has a similar look and feel. I have worked with this yarn, so I'm not showing you the other end of this ball, and it has the same kind of size and length within each of these balls. The difference is that the Cozy On Up from Hobbycraft has a 70% acrylic, 30% mix of wool, as opposed to Sirdar Adventure, which is an 80% acrylic, 20% wool. So they're very, very similar and they're a great substitute. I think that Yarn Bee has something similar. So there are lots of alternatives to this yarn, but any super bulky weight yarn that recommends a hook size between 10 to 12 millimeters will be perfect to recreate this pattern. I'm going to be sticking with the Sirdar Adventure because I really love this shade. So this is the Golden Dawn, and they come in 200-gram balls, but it only has 106 meters of yarn on it. They do go quite far, but you are going to need quite a few balls of yarn depending on which size you're going to make. So I made a UK King, which is the same as a US Queen sized bed runner, and I used 5 balls of Sirdar Adventure. Here you can see all the sizes of the blanket that you can make up, from a US twin, which is the same as a UK single, a UK double, which I think is a full size bed, a queen size, the equivalent to a UK king, the king size, which is only available in the US, and a California king, which is the UK's super king. So the other materials that we're going to need is a 12mm crochet hook. Now this isn't the prettiest of crochet hooks, I'll give you that, but it is really comfortable to use because it has that great soft grip. I do have a 10mm furls, but not a 12mm, so I might have to rectify that. You're going to need a pair of scissors. I've got some heavy duty ones, and I'm going to be using a chunky yarn needle, mainly because of the eye of the needle being so much bigger than a standard one. When you're working with these kind of ends, you either need to crochet the ends in or find a larger darning needle. If you're not familiar with the linen stitch, you may well need some stitch markers to put in your first and last stitches, just to keep things really simple for making sure you're working into the right place. So gather all of those materials and let's get started. So this pattern is worked in rows before we add on our fringing, and all the sizes that have been provided earlier do not include the fringe, but will create a small overhang on the side of the bed as well. All the instructions are going to be given in US crochet terms, and wherever possible I will provide the UK terms to start at least. So we're going to be making the linen stitch, and obviously I'm going to give you all the different stitch counts for the different sizes, and they'll be given in order from the size of a twin bed all the way up to a California king in that order. So make sure that you've selected the size that you need to make for your bed. If you need to recheck those, you can find a link in the description box to check the sizes and the measurements against your own bed and make the size that you feel will be appropriate. So with our 12mm crochet hook, we're going to start by making a chain, and the chain is going to be quite long. So for a twin, which is a UK single, you need to make a starting chain of 180. For the full size or the UK double size bed, you're going to need to make a starting chain of 138. And then for a queen or a UK king bed, you need to make a starting chain of 150. the US king size, you need to make a starting chain of 174, and for that super king or the California king, you need to make a starting chain of 182. So go ahead and make your chain just by yarning over the hook and bringing that through the loop on your hook. If you're not familiar with working with larger or super bulky weight yarns, when you're making your chain, I'd recommend keeping your tension quite loose, because a lot of the yarn will run through your fingers as you bring that back through the loop on your hook. So these chains are quite supersized alongside with the supersized yarn. So make your chain and I'll meet you back in a moment for the rest of row 1. So I'm making a very miniature version. I've created a chain of 20, which is what the stitch multiple is. So if you want to recreate this pattern in any other style, you just need your stitch multiple of 2. So I've made a chain of 20. You should have a chain of either 108, 138, 150, 174 or 182. So continuing in row 1, we're going to start by making 1 single crochet into the second chain from hook, remembering that this loop does not count as a stitch. And this is our first chain. We're going to be inserting our hook under that first loop of the second chain. We yarn over and bring our loop up, yarn over and pull through 2 to make our US single crochet or our UK double crochet. We then chain 1 and we're going to skip the next chain, and then we work under the next chain, working our single crochet. If you're worried about being able to find the right stitch at the end, I'd recommend this. Just pop a stitch marker under that first single crochet that you made so that you know exactly where to work your final stitch when you come back from working this long row. So after we've done our single crochet, we start that pattern repeat again, which is a chain 1, skip the next chain and work 1 single crochet or 1 UK double crochet into that next chain. And this is us creating single crochet and chain 1 spaces. So we chain 1, skip 1 chain, we've worked into that one, so you see that you've got a stitch coming out of that one here. So we skip the next one and we're working under the next one. Work that US single crochet, the UK double crochet into the next, ready to repeat. We chain 1, skip that next chain and 1 single crochet into the next. We're going to continue that all the way down our chain, so you should end with 1 single crochet into that last chain, and I'll meet you back there when you've worked your last stitch into your final chain. So obviously my first row was a lot quicker than yours, and I imagine you have a really nice huge length of the linen stitch here. If you want to, you can of course go and place that first row over your bed just to make sure that it's hanging where you want, but be aware that it will shrink in a little bit as you make more rows, especially if you've used this yarn, because it does kind of work on itself and become quite difficult to undo or to frog your project. So at the end of row 1 you should have the equivalent of 55, 70, 76, 88 or 92 single crochets depending on which size you're making, and you'll also have 53, 68, 74, 86 or 80 chain 1 spaces. If at any point you do need to look at that written pattern, don't forget that it is linked in the description box for you so that you can confirm that you're following along for the right size for your pattern. So going into row 2, we start with a chain of 1. Now, if you, like me, you struggle to see those chain 1s when you come back to them, this is the perfect time to grab your stitch marker and place it through those top 2 loops of that chain 1 that you've just made. I'm going to use a lockable stitch marker here because I know how clever I am at pulling them out. Because remembering that this loop doesn't count, but this chain 1 does count as a single crochet, and that's here and throughout the pattern. So we're not going to work into the single crochet just underneath that chain 1. Instead, we're going to work into the chain 1 space. So we're going to insert our hook into that chain 1 space from the previous row to work our first US single crochet, followed by a chain 1. You can see that now we've worked that. This is where we're going to work our final stitch, is through this chain 1. When we come back at the end of row 3, we're going to be working into this chain 1. So you can see there's a space, and this is where we work our final stitch. So continuing with row 2, we're going to skip the next single crochet and work into that chain 1 space in between, for working a further US single crochet. We then chain 1, skip that single crochet, working into the next chain 1 space. So this is our stitch pattern from here. We work 1 single crochet into the chain 1 space, we chain 1, and then skip that next single crochet, and we repeat this all the way down. So 1 single crochet into that chain 1 space, chain 1, skip the next single crochet. So continue to repeat that all the way down, working that 1 single crochet into that chain 1 space, followed by a chain 1, and skipping that next single crochet, and I'll meet you back for your last stitch where we've placed that stitch marker. So keep working all the way down, and I'll meet you there in a moment. So once you've worked your final single crochet and chain 1, we're ready to work our final single crochet into our last stitch. So I'm just going to remove my stitch marker and work 1 single crochet into that final stitch. And that completes row 2. So for rows 3 to 27, we're going to repeat row 2 all the way up, and it should end at a measurement of about 18 inches. And that's quite wide because it looks great when it's draped over the edge of your bed. So if you want to make yours any wider, you can do, or you can recreate this as a blanket by just continuing to repeat those rows. So let's do the beginning of row 3 together. So let's do row 3 together so we can make sure we're happy with where we're placing that final stitch. So of course we start row 3 with a chain 1, and we can place our stitch marker through the top of that chain, either through one loop or through both, just so we can find it easily when we return at the end of the next row. We skip that stitch underneath the chain 1 because this chain 1 counts as a stitch, and we're going to work 1 single crochet into that chain 1 space, followed by a chain 1. We skip the next single crochet, working 1 single crochet into the next, followed by a chain 1. We skip the next single crochet, and we're ready to work and continue that pattern repeat. So if you remember, that pattern repeat is 1 single crochet, followed by a chain 1, and skipping that single crochet underneath. So repeat that across all the way to your last stitch, and I'll meet you there so that you're happy with where you're placing your final stitch. So we avoid those edges of that bed runner coming in and it turning into a triangle. So continue with row 3, and I'll meet you at the end of it. So I've worked my final single crochet and chain 1 of row 3, and here's where we need to place our final single crochet of the row, where our stitch marker is. So I'm just going to remove that stitch marker and insert my hook back into that chain 1. You can grab 1 loop, 2 loop, whatever's easiest for you. For the neatest edge, ideally you should grab 2 loops of your chain and just complete that final single crochet. It's going to keep your edges as neat as possible if you're working back into that chain 1 rather than to the space just in front of it. So I've still got my stitch marker in place from where we turned on the final row, so I can still find my chain 1 really easily on the return. So if you're finding that that will help you locate those stitches, continue to mark your chain 1, your turning chain, each time you turn your project, so that it makes it easier for you to find. I've just done my turning chain ready to go into row 4. So we're just going to repeat row 2 all the way up until we've reached the width of our bed runner that we like. If you're replicating this pattern as written, you'll be doing a total of 27 rows. And we've already done 3 of them. It's a great project to do in front of the TV, especially if you're marking those edges, because it makes it easier to find the final stitches. I really love the linen stitch, and I can't wait to share another pattern with you that features this stitch and is corresponding to this bed runner, which is the Roving Dreams cushion, which will be available for you. As soon as it's available, I'll pop a card here for you, and I'll link it in the description box for you too. But yeah, keep going all the way up until you've made your 27 rows. You can then fasten off and weave in those ends, and I'll be back to show you how to work your fringe and create a tied fringe as well in the next video. Until then, keep it cozy.